Welcome to Master Your Merger, the podcast for leaders navigating the people side of mergers and acquisitions. Each week, your host Klint Kendrick talks with deal makers, HR leaders, and integration experts to uncover what really works when it comes to people, culture, and performance during a deal. From retaining top talent to aligning leadership, you'll hear real stories and actionable insights from the people doing the work, all designed to help you make your merger work. If you're leading through M&A, this is your weekly playbook.
Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast. Joining us today is Ned Eustace, the head of Highbridge Leadership, which is a boutique consulting firm focusing on M&A leadership and transformation. Ned has extensive experience as a strategy consultant at IBM and an executive coach and organizational psychologist. Ned's guided both buy-side and sell-side leaders through the intricate challenges of M&A, offering valuable insights into effective leadership and successful transformations. And Ned's also somebody that I'm glad to consider a friend. So welcome to the Master Your Merger podcast, Ned. Thanks for saying yes.
Thanks for having me, Clint. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah.
Hello from snowy New York.
Well, and to give folks a sense of time, we have snowy Arkansas, so we're getting it all over the place. So it is the winter, and talking with friends is a good thing. Well, hey, Ned, you've worked with top leaders across a number of industries during their most critical moments in M&A. What do you see as some of the biggest challenges leaders face when trying to scale the impact of a fast-growing organization?
It's a great question. I love starting this conversation with what are your greatest challenges? As an executive coach, that's often the question I'm asking first as well. It just invites a introspective type of dialogue. So I just think that's a really appropriate place to start. But I think when I think about that, what are the biggest challenges? I definitely always think first about strategy, implementing your strategy, and exactly when and how to introduce your strategic vision into the system. So when I'm working with executives, when you start with thinking about what are your biggest challenges with introducing this new strategy, especially in the acquisition space, it's ripe with a lot of fruitful conversation, because I think any executive, acquisitions or otherwise, knowing how and when to introduce your strategy takes an enormous amount of emotional intelligence. And you can tell just from the initial conversation if somebody feels as though they've introduced their strategy too soon or too late, that they're meeting a bunch of resistance. Some of it's communicated, some of it's not. Or I can sense whether or not they are avoiding engaging in the friction that comes with introducing a strategy. So that's a great place for us to start in terms of understanding what is this like for them. And it's also a great way to start a conversation about how is this going for you? Are you getting the types of outcomes that you're trying to impress onto the business? What's so challenging about that for so many leaders is that many leaders, when you start working with them, don't necessarily see the change happening to them. They often see the change is something that they're affecting and driving. And so there's this kind of gap of perspective, I think, that doesn't allow them to be available for others in their needs, what they need to manage these emotional shifts and manage these cultural shifts. So being able to recognize that you are going through something and having the emotional intelligence to then be available for others is really important. Maybe a better example is I was working with a CSO recently, and he was brought in to drive really operational shifts within a healthcare hospital network system, brought together through a lot of acquisition. He had a very clear idea of what the future state should look like, what a consolidated organization should look like. And he was very good at building consensus and very good at describing what the change should be. And all the executives around him, including the acquired executives, he found would often agree with him in the room, but then quietly resist. And what wound up evolving was they actually started going around him up to the CEO to explain and describe what they actually need to do.
Yeah.
He got very binary in his thinking. He got very frustrated that they basically weren't capable of driving the type of change they needed. And what he couldn't see was that they weren't actually, they were just kind of moving him along. They were just kind of getting him past the conversation because they knew that he was going to be pushing them so hard. So he had to learn through 360 feedback how to slow that down and understand that he was really driving the change very early from their perspective, but also in some ways, even though he thought he was very involved in driving the change, he was actually pretty avoidant. He was kind of describing what the future state should be and then getting frustrated that people weren't acting on it or quickly enough. So just understanding that this wasn't necessarily about his opinion about how they were doing, but more about his availability to what's next in those conversations just dissolved a lot of his frustration and allowed him to think about what's the EQ components necessary and driving the types of change that is actually necessary to bring the organization together. So knowing how and when to do that and the emotional intelligence that goes with it, it's not easy, but it's definitely something that's available to everybody once they get the necessary perspective to drive that kind of change.
Is that something that you see a lot? I know that I've been to announcement meetings, for example, where an executive will get up on stage and they've known about the deal for a while. They may have instigated the deal, in fact, and they want to get up and basically launch into a strategy conversation with a bunch of people that have just found out about the deal. And it feels really poorly timed. I imagine that behind the scenes, that dynamic can be frustrating for other leaders as well. So do you see that kind of thing happen a lot, Ned?
You do. I think it's in the acquisition space is particularly interesting because there's the idea of the strategy is a shared concept. Mm-hmm. And so even if you have a very clear idea of what the future state should be, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got buy-in, support, or commitment, even from the other executives that are around you that need to implement it. That fascinating early experience I had in this space was in my time at IBM. They had launched Watson Health, which is $1 billion play into the market. Really at the early stages of AI and medical data and consumer and patient experience, and in some ways too early. The way the business was built was through inorganic growth, through acquisition. They basically brought together 3 different companies that own different parts of the client segment and all brought data into the room. And I sat in the room with these acquired CEOs, and they did this incredible marketing advertisement about the future of healthcare and data and the patient experience. And the lights came up and the sponsoring GM stood in front of the room and said, "So this is what we're going to do. Like, let's go for it." And the 3 CEOs were like, "Well, yeah, that looks great. Who's going to do that?" Well, you're talking to us, like we're going to do that. So it's just, they wind up selling that business off in piece parts, and that didn't wind up launching. And that, companies like IBM can make plays like that. I'm sure there was that other value that came out of doing that transaction. But it was a profound moment for me, realizing all of the executives in the room were staring at each other. The vision, strategy, being realistic about where you're at, where the business is at, where the market is at. It's really just about having realistic conversations, because those are the emotional gaps that you need new behaviors, you need to be really productive with together. And that just can't be assumed because you give a great impassioned speech.
Right. I mean, the ability to really rally folks around a cause is a great thing. But then when it comes to executing on that aligned vision, that strategy, when everybody's come together, does require them to trust one another and collaborate. So when you think about getting teams from that point where they're aligning, so we're now agreeing, at least in concept, to actually executing, trusting, working together, what do you do to get teams to do that when they're under a lot of pressure?
Pressure. Pressure is the key word there. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face, kind of concept. I say that jokingly. I think pressure is absolutely critical component to think about in the acquisition space, but in business in general. When I work with leaders, we do a lot of psychometric assessments, and we come to understand very quickly that the way that we are perceived by others when there's pressure in the system is radically different than the way we're perceived when things are going well or things are calmer. Our ability to recognize that is very limited, because in some ways, some of the exact same behaviors we do all the time, it's very confusing that they're getting a different outcome. And the reality is it's how it's held by other people's perspective. So I think that idea of pressure in terms of when you're thinking about trust and collaboration is absolutely critical. So, but with collaboration in teams, you want that. You want people to be collaborating because you're talking about innovation, right? You're talking about driving into new spaces. And so you've got to be able to collaborate, and you've got to be able to have conflict. Like, you need to be able to have conflict under pressure. So you're talking about pressure, and you're talking about being able to come together and collaborate around conflict, because you're going into new spaces. So inherently, you are going to seek out and surface friction and be able to collaborate around that. So I definitely work with leaders to first recognize, this concept of how are we perceived under pressure internally. I then try to help teams define their role as conflict seekers. It's our job to go surface friction. And then how do we do that well? But, the third, I think the other part of your question was not just about collaboration, but about trust. Yeah. And I think that's a really important element. When you think about it, you can have collaboration, but without psychological safety, a word that I think we use too often as this kind of catchphrase, right? But you need to feel safe to be able to have conflict around collaboration into productivity, right? So it's absolutely important that if I sense that a team doesn't have trust, and there's lots of ways to sense that early, it's something that you have to work on directly with the team as a team activity, not necessarily as an individual activity. And I say that because you often hear, we need psychological safety. And I hear people say, we need to trust and verify, trust but verify, or assume. No, the one that drives me nuts is assume positive intent. It's not enough to tell somebody, you just have to assume my intent is positive. Mm-hmm. It's a context sport. It's about your perspective. It's about how that impacts you, how you're listening, how we're interacting together. I'm going to give you a better example, perhaps, that drives this point home. I work with a team, actually, even a couple months ago. It's a digital agency, ad care agency, and it was a portfolio company from a PE that had acquired an even smaller company. Okay. And it's even a smaller company, when they came in, had a lot of toxic behavior. So what was interesting was they were highly productive. It didn't necessarily mean they didn't have trust. But in the new setting, what happened was they doubled in size, not in manpower, but in the revenue that they brought in 1 year. So the pressure got dialed way up. And suddenly, the way that they were interacting with each other, which was previously described as passionate, quickly became toxic. Okay. And the examples when I was brought into this team activity was they were wondering if they needed to put a couple individuals on a performance improvement plan. And these were high-performing individuals, but it's so disruptive. And really what they were saying was so unprofessional. It was well beyond passion. When we spoke to the acquiring executive, he didn't want to kind of take sides. He's like, this is how we operate. But what he didn't realize was that whereas before being kind of avoidant in those moments, in quieter moments, empowered the team to work it out and what could be described as passion. But now with things ratcheted up, it was really derailing the business. It was causing a month or two drag and delay of being able to come back together and work together. So we had to tackle this. We could have sat individuals down and said, you're the problem, but we took it as a team activity. We said the team has got to figure out this. First of all, we have to recognize this is how it's like performing under pressure. We need to steer this dialogue back into more productive, trust-like conflict resolution type language where we're to share experience. And we need to work with the senior executive to recognize that in these moments, stepping away isn't actually helpful in moments of crisis. The team needs a leader who steps in, not to take sides, but to help the team be productive with the dialogue. So it's not about finger pointing at each other, but it's about taking the concepts that we're trying to address and the necessary friction to put it back into the business. And the team, but if they made a team activity, a team problem with new operating principles about how we want to work together, the conversation shifted pretty quickly.
Well, that's interesting. I think about integrations or even the first year or two of operations after an acquisition between the teams that haven't worked together at all before. And, what you can get away with somebody that you've known and worked with for years and that same communication style with somebody who's brand new, it requires a little massaging a lot of the time. So that trust definitely changes the context of some of those behaviors.
Well, you bring up a great point. I mean, when we're talking about the word collaboration and trust, you're talking about building productive relationships at work. Ultimately, as a leader, that's what your goal is to do is, I said, surface conflict in order to then work together collaboratively to work productively together. And, knowing each other's stories, understanding who we are as people, these moments of working through conflict actually bond us and bring us together. So what I often see in acquisitions is it's almost avoidance. Like it's almost like the concept of making everything easy and smooth, as opposed to coming together to tackle problems together. That's actually what binds you together. It's those war stories that you have together. It's those points of friction that you work together to resolve to create something new that's now yours together. That's actually what pulls you in together. But all too often it becomes the narratives that we use to point fingers at each other, to explain to each other why this isn't working or why you're not working or they're not working. And those stories happen very quickly in the acquisition space. We very quickly start the operating model of describing to each other who we are, how we are, what our capacities are, what our capabilities are. So you really got to get that right early. You got to dial up that team concept early.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We often in the world of M&A talk about the first 90 or 100 days in an organization. And, what I'm hearing you say is that really is the time to lay that foundation of trust and bring those teams together. Obviously, avoiding those conversations can make it difficult or delay that leadership integration. What are some of the other pitfalls you see in that first couple of months of two leadership teams coming together?
I'm laughing. I'm reminded you and I often we hear leaders often even earlier than the first 90 days. Tell us about the great dinners they've had.
Right. We sat down, we talked to each other, we had a great meeting when we were all on our very best behavior, and so we're absolutely the same. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is going to be a slam dunk. We see the client the same, we see the market the same. We see the same opportunities, the same problems. Like this is going to be, yeah. So it's really interesting to me that there's some headwind into these conversations. What leaders find challenging or what's challenging about working with leaders in the first 90 days starts even before the first 90 days. And I think what's frustrating for folks like you and I is that although we work in a very soft-skilled space, we're dealing with people that are bringing to us their opinions and not their facts about the matter. And they're the ones that are being super soft about how they're forming really important, very key business decisions. So I think probably when I think about it that way, I think probably the first mistake leaders make is that they don't bring data into the room early about leadership and cultural and organizational risks that are necessary that we have got to mitigate and invest in and support to have a better conversation. And I think all too often, trying to have conversations with leaders that tell you things are going to be great about, hey, but no, we should really get some more science behind this, almost feels to them as though you don't get it. Like you're pushing against something that, well, let's wait and see if that's a problem. It's already so much work. We don't want to include more things. That psychology is just time and again, just false. But I guess the first recommendation would definitely be get data in the room. There's really good ways to involve the sell side leadership team in great conversations about who they are, what their capacity is, what their skill set is, what they think they need for success, who they think their key rock stars are, what they think works really well that you can't break, what you think you need to invest in to get to the next level. And from all of that, you can really hear, because if you hold back in your mind, you know what the deal case is, and you know how your organization on the buy side what it looks like, you can see very quickly all these gaps that they're going to have to travel through. And then you can start to have a conversation, well, how do we support them? How do we set them up for the best amount of success? So I think now we're getting into the 90 days. And that from there, you can think about, well, often we think about, like, this next area I think about is retention. I think often we're in conversations with people about, well, yes, therefore they're critical. We have to retain them. We recognize that. Let's throw some dollars at them. And I think probably the next mistake people make is assuming that monetary retention is enough to retain leaders. I've seen data from you specifically, 25% of executives leave within the first year. I've seen other data, 10% of employees that leave of your acquisition within the first year significantly impact your deal case. So you see these massive numbers, and even with retention, there's a lot of, or retention dollars, there's a lot of retention issues. So I think the second mistake is not recognizing that you need to have a more thoughtful onboarding that's more personal. That retention also includes non-monetary retention support, where you're really providing leaders with mentorship, but thoughtful mentorship, not just assigning somebody to be a buddy. Mentorship that's specific to the type of leader that they were, what they aspire to. Some leaders are highly technical from smaller companies, and now you're expecting to manage a P&L. That's a huge gap to close. Some people wind up getting sucked fully into board reviews and quarterly reviews and completely lose track of their business. Well, they need a lot more operational and executive assistance support to get this out the door and manage upwards. Many need coaching to be able to navigate this transition into the next leadership role that's going to involve them, require that they grow in new ways and develop in new ways. So having more thoughtful onboarding is absolutely critical. And you can't just feed them into your standard onboarding that you would use for normal executives. It has to be in the context of being successful.
Those are all really great points. Let me just ask this, Ned. So when I think about this as sort of a system, right? Those dinners are important, right? Getting to know each other, building that early foundation, as much as they're not necessarily great data, it's the foundation, the beginning of a working together or a possible working together situation. So then we do the deal, go through that ongoing relationship building, come together and look at how the strategy is going to move the business forward. Obviously, you need to align around that, align around ways of working, and then to your point, start to grow into new skills that maybe the person hasn't had to exercise before. If they're, say, a serial entrepreneur going into a large organization, it's a lot of change. There's a lot going on there. And I see a lot of leaders that end up just absolutely exhausted and burned out from all of that change.
Wow.
So how do you help leaders through that?
I hear it's interesting. I like the way you're laying out the timeline. I think so all this change is happening. I do think there's one more component to that. I do think you need to have a system in the room. And I think I'll get to the burnout concept as part of this, but I think you need to have, you really do need to focus on team alignment early, team effectiveness early. And that doesn't mean just strategic alignment like we were talking before, but so I think often another mistake leaders make is that there's a real sink or swim type attitude about the whole thing. If you talk to senior executives about the gaps that leaders need to close, they often say, well, that's why we bought them. They're bringing in this leadership skill set, right. Or even on the buy side, they're saying, well, that's why you bought us. So I'm just going to come in and tell you how this is or set the pace and you're going to follow. That's rarely the case. You're creating something new. I was on a client maybe a year and a half ago, and the head of sales and marketing, there's huge gaps in sales and marketing. They were having trouble closing new labels, and actually getting the back office really wasn't working. So she was getting frustrated in general. But what exited her within 6 months, she wrote a note to her sponsoring GM that they use Slack and all their communications on Slack. And unbeknownst to her, the company had an alternative system, and it was kind of an internal war, a very aggressive one. And so her sponsoring GM forwarded her note to his executives suite. She wound up getting scapegoated by the other senior executives that as somebody like that didn't get like what the company was trying to do, all around the fact that she thought she was raising a good issue.
Oh,
right?
Fascinating.
Right. She thought she got scapegoated immediately, and suddenly she was something that didn't get it. So you need to have leadership alignment early, because there was no concept of team or us in it together. It was like the narratives happens right away. If you're coming in, it could come out of left field. Like, all I did was come into this new organization and suggest that we continue to use this platform that we've been using for an entire time. And instead of making this a team activity or something we need to resolve together, it quickly became an example of, oh, this new person doesn't get what we're trying to do. And she was like, you know what? Like, I'm not doing that. No. So you've got to get this stuff early. And this stuff does lead to burnout, for sure. So I thought that was an important point to progress forward. Do you mind telling me again a little more about with burnout? Do you mind repeating that question one more time? I want to make sure.
Yeah, no worries. Well, and I think what you just shared probably points to a lot of that, Ned. So, somebody comes into the organization, they don't understand how to navigate it. They step on the proverbial landmine, or, walk into the proverbial buzzsaw without even knowing it. So that mentorship you pointed to is really important to help them avoid those. Even in the absence of those landmines, it's a lot of change, right? There's new systems to learn. There's probably different levels of support that go into it. And I personally found that even when an acquirer says, hey, we're going to leave you alone, right? We're going to let you go do your own thing, they usually don't mean it the same way that the seller hears it, right? When I say I'm going to leave you alone, I actually think, great, now I've got a bigger piggy bank to get into. And what the buyer means is, well, we're going to let you kind of do what you want, but here are a very different set of guardrails than the guardrails that you've had previously. And you've got to navigate all of this change to really your remit. You've renegotiated strategy within a larger organization. The buyer now has to manage these new people coming in with their legacy ways of working. I've seen really exhausted catching executives because they're trying to help shepherd these folks through, even without the toxic landmines, which certainly seen my share of those. So on both sides, everybody's just exhausted trying to make this thing work, I've found a few months in. So how do we keep leaders from getting completely fried as they go through this process?
First of all, that's such a great picture of what this is like and what makes acquisitions, change on steroids. I mean, there's so much going on, and there's so much happening that our first reaction of people that want to help them is to not distract them even more, to lighten their load, or to just acknowledge they're already doing so much. Let's not contribute to their burnout. As a psychologist, that's actually really tough to hear, because it's almost like they need to build the muscle to counter what is going to be an inevitable feeling of overwhelm, an inevitable feeling of burnout. This is going to happen on an acquisition by nature of what you just described. Right. So you actually need to not see this as a time variable or time constrained conversation. It needs to be something is seen as shifting, an investment in shifting the mindset away from this concept of things that contribute to burnout and things that would contribute more to a healthier, adaptive, optimistic type mindset. So we're really talking about being able to get out in front of how we perceive all of the challenges that are happening around us. And it's that perspective of, are these things do they feel overwhelming to us, and why? What happens pretty quick. So almost any executive I work with, acquisition or otherwise, will often tell me this is a variable of time. I would do all that. I would be all these things if I only had more time.
Okay.
It's almost never about more time. That's more of an expression of, I'm overwhelmed. And what one thing executives really need to think about early is at some point when you feel overwhelmed, you start living your stresses instead of being with them and observing them and seeing them as business stresses. You start to internalize them and start to live with them, right? And that contributes to our language around these concepts of burnout and overwhelm or internal feeling statements you're making. And it basically brings up a picture of I've had enough, I can't do more. So I think really what I work on with executives when I think about burnout is trying to get away from the general feeling of exhaustion that comes with burnout and get more to, if we're going to address this early, there's kind of two main components I think about with burnout. I think about this concept of adaptability as a mindset shift and this concept of optimism as a mindset shift. And I don't mean that in a Pollyannic way. I think a specific example of adaptability for me comes to mind with, I had a CEO. He was a military guy. He was the best athlete. He worked on weekends. He had incredible willpower, right? But he reached his own threshold. The roles got too big. Everything got too big. The business expanded too quickly. And so he needed to focus, in my mind, he was very optimistic and a can-do attitude, but he needed to focus on adaptability. Okay. Meaning he needed to not only adapt his leadership style, but he needed to help other people adapt to the changes around him. So rather than going in thinking that he needed to do more, he needed to work more on the weekends, he needed to pick up more, he wound up in a very judgmental state of mind. Other people weren't doing enough. So he had to adapt a mindset shift that was more about enabling and empowering others. And what is his role in enabling, empowering them to be more successful, rather than where he was caught psychologically was that it was a finite amount that he had to give and he was running out and other people weren't doing enough. We had to kind of separate that internal narrative that was happening for him. And he was then forced to think about, well, if given that I'm out of energy here, what do I now do to lead in different ways that ultimately are going to bring other people through the changes that I'm trying to affect? And then with the optimism, I worked with another CEO. He's just very pessimistic. He had a huge laundry list of activities that his team was not getting to. He was just so irritated. And he had talked about like having better OKRs and better systems to operationalize and manage and track and hold people accountable for that very long list. It literally just kept getting pushed out. So by the time I got to him, that same list was the same one he had 6 months ago with zero movement. But what he was realizing when I talked to his team was it really, optimism wasn't the only concept, but he had gotten into such a binary judgmental state of mind also that his leaders were insufficient and not moving things along, that he kind of forgot that it wasn't just his job to hold up the list and say, you're still not doing it. He needed to spend more time with them in the moment and helping them see that, one, he believed that they could address these issues. And I don't mean like, hey, pep rally, I mean, spend more time with them, helping them to think through what are the hurdles that they are facing. And then using his insight, not to say, if I was doing it, you should have already had it done, which is actually keeping him away from the business and removing him, but saying the insight I get from how I feel about that I would have it done is informed by my past experiences, but I'm going to use that to have a good dialogue with you about what is this like for you, and then how do we resolve these questions together. So that became, the optimism scores went way up on the team. It just, everybody felt so under his thumb all the time. So those are two things that get you out of burnout, this adaptability and this optimism. And none of this is about grit. None of this is about perseverance or doubling down. It's about flowing with what's coming to you and meeting it and observing it and then working with it as opposed to getting overwhelmed by it. So coaching conversations can really help with that mindset shift.
Oh, that's fantastic. We've spent a lot of time, Ned, talking about transitions, talking about teams that move from challenge to effective and some of the ways that leaders work through that. Yeah. If you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice, your top tip, if you will, for becoming more confident and effective leaders, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, it's a hard question, Clint. Oh, well, first of all, I mean, leadership is not something that's owned by magic individuals, right? Leadership to me is something that flows through people that inspire others. Mm-hmm. And leadership is a concept that it's not something you drive into others, but is a statement that others make about you. So your confidence and effectiveness as yourself as a leader, I think that's look, so it's an intrinsic inside question you're asking, because I think each leader has to reach inside themselves and figure out, confidence comes from leading through your values and leading through pursuing changes that are meaningful to you. They focus on a bigger why about why this is important and what this is for. And when you're leading in that way, when you're able to lead others by explaining to them that your behavior, although is different from what you were doing before because you're shifting into a new direction, what that new behavior is for this thing that is important to you and to the business, then you start to influence others and inspire others.
Yeah.
And what I would say to that, just to drive that intrinsic kind of concept home, is what you see in the acquisition space, Clint, is a lot of extrinsic motivation. So I think of extrinsic motivation in 3 Ps, right? So I think about payment, right? So we think about retention payment, that's extrinsic motivation, right? It's your paycheck. I think about pain, right? And I think about punishment. These are ways of motivating people. Now, those are 3 Ps that sound particularly negative, but the reality is often we're leading ourselves with, external payment. That's external. That it's finite. It's table stakes, but that's why those payments don't drive retention. They don't drive new ways of working. They don't drive innovation. They're just keeping people where they are. And then pain, we always talk about in change management terms, we need like a burning platform.
Right.
Yes, that will definitely get you jumping off, but that's not going to drive and inspire and encourage. It's certainly motivating, but it's finite. It's limited. It's short term, as is punishment. Punishment is punitive. If you don't do this, then this will impact you individually. That's fear-based leadership, all of which is highly effective, but also not ultimately going to drive, inspire confidence and effectiveness. So, if you're able to reach within yourself, think about what's your own journey. And rather than thinking about other people on the journey with you, think about them as they're having their own journey also. Now you can start to wonder, what is it about their intrinsic motivation that is inspiring to them, that's bringing them along on this journey? They're not necessarily like, you're not captaining a boat and their crew on your boat with your inspiration. You're able to see them as boats around you that need to be coordinated and brought together into this unknown path and journey that you're on together, into these uncharted waters that you're going to be working on together. If you're able to find that inner answers, then leadership, confidence, and effectiveness will flow. It'll flow through you. And it's really wonderful to see leaders that find that in themselves.
Oh, that's fantastic, Ned. So really the opportunity to figure out why I'm doing things this way, and the ability to communicate that change can be a really powerful thing. Well, Ned, thank you so much for joining me on today's podcast, and I'm looking forward to connecting again soon.
What a pleasure, Clint. Thank you for some excellent questions. I really enjoyed this.
Well, thank you so much, Ned, for joining us on the Master Your Merger podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Ned, his strategies and insights, you can visit the Leader Integration section of hvleaders.com. Leaders can also access the top 5 leadership integration pitfalls and how to avoid them, and then sign up for occasional insights and resources. Ned regularly writes about leadership, coaching, and organizational transformation and M&A, all of which you can find on Ned's LinkedIn profile. Again, Ned, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for listening to Master Your Merger, hosted by Klint Kendrick. Be sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. And if you found this valuable, share it with someone leading through a deal. To explore toolkits, resources, and upcoming programs, including our free roundtables, visit masteryourmerger.com. We'll see you next time.